Chapter 1. The $1,000,000 Doorstop. On a Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1799, 12-year-old Conrad Reed pulled a 17-pound rock from a creek on his family's North Carolina farm. It was bright yellow, unnaturally heavy, and unlike anything he had seen before. He dragged it home and showed his father, John Reed, a German immigrant who worked tobacco fields 20 miles east of Charlotte. The family gathered around, turned it over, knocked it against wood. No one recognized it. No one in that household had ever seen raw gold. So they made it a doorstop. For 3 years, the Reed family walked past a fortune every single day. The 17-pound gold nugget, worth approximately $3,600 at the time, equivalent to over $80,000 today, sat wedged against their kitchen door. Mud scraped across it. Brooms knocked into it. Children stepped over it on their way to meals. It became invisible, just another object in a house full of tools and necessities. This was 50 years before the California gold rush would make headlines across America. This was the first documented discovery of gold in the United States, and it was being used as household furniture. The Reeds were not looking for wealth. They were farmers chasing survival, not treasure. John worked from dawn until dark, managing crops, repairing equipment, paying off debts. His world measured value in bushels of corn and bales of tobacco, not mysterious rocks from the creek. In 1802, a visitor to the Reed farm noticed the doorstop, picked it up, and told John to take it to a jeweler in Fayetteville. John wrapped it in cloth, loaded it into his wagon, and made the 2-day journey to town carrying 17 pounds of pure gold, with no idea what he was holding. The jeweler's hands moved carefully over the surface the moment John set it on the counter. He weighed it, tested it. His eyes narrowed with calculation, but his face stayed neutral. He looked up at John Reed, this sunburned farmer in worn clothes standing in his shop, and spoke casually. "I can give you $3.50 for this." John hesitated. He had no reference point, no way to know if this was fair. The jeweler waited, patient and calm, as if he were doing John a favor. $3.50 was more than John made in a week of farm work. For a rock that had been holding a door open, it seemed like a gift. "All right," John said. They shook hands. The jeweler melted down the nugget within days and sold the gold for $3,600. He had just made more in one transaction than most farmers earned in 5 years. John Reed went home with pocket change, told his family about the sale, and returned to his fields. The door swung freely without its weight. Life continued. But the truth does not stay buried forever. Over the following months, John began hearing things, conversations at the market, stories from travelers passing through. He heard what raw gold was actually worth. He heard numbers that made his stomach turn. Slowly, the realization crept over him like cold water. He had been robbed, not with a gun or a threat, but with a handshake and a smile. When John finally confirmed the real value of what he had sold, he did not shout or break things. He stood in his field, silent, staring at the creek where his son had found the stone 3 years earlier. The rage that settled into him was not hot. It was cold, methodical, and permanent. If one rock from that creek was worth $3,600, what else was down there? John Reed returned to the water with shovels, pans, and a new purpose. He was no longer a farmer tolerating a strange discovery. He was a man who had lost a fortune once and would not let it happen again. And what he was about to find would dwarf the doorstop entirely. Within 2 years, the Reed family would pull a 28-pound nugget from the same creek, the largest gold discovery in American history at that time. But first, John had to learn how to see what had been invisible all along. The first gold rush in the United States was beginning, and no one outside of North Carolina even knew it was happening yet. Chapter 2. The Great Deception and Awakening. John Reed did not sleep well after he learned the truth. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the jeweler's calm face, heard the words $3.50, felt the weight of the handshake that had cost him a fortune. The anger was useful. It sharpened his focus. It turned a farmer who barely thought about money into a man obsessed with what lay beneath his land. But anger alone does not find gold. John needed knowledge. He began asking questions, carefully at first, then more boldly. He traveled to nearby towns, spoke with blacksmiths and traders, anyone who might know about minerals and metals. Most people had nothing useful to offer. Gold was a rumor, a distant concept tied to faraway places. But John kept asking, and eventually he found believers. In 1803, John formed a partnership with three men: Reverend James Love, his son James Love Jr., and Martin Pfeiffer Jr., a local planter. None of them were miners, but they trusted John's story about the 17-pound nugget, and they believed there was more in Little Meadow Creek. The four men returned to the water with shovels, pickaxes, and crude wooden pans. They had no training, just determination and the creek bed in front of them. For weeks, they found nothing but mud and exhaustion. Then, in the summer of 1803, small nuggets and flakes began appearing in the gravel. The men worked faster, digging deeper, expanding their search along the creek banks. And then they found it. John saw it first, a mass of yellow metal wedged between two rocks in the creek bed, partially buried in silt. He called the others over, and together they pried it loose. When John lifted it from the water, his knees nearly buckled. The nugget was the size of a man's boot, rough and irregular, but unmistakably gold. It took both hands to hold it steady. Water streamed off its surface, revealing the dull yellow shine beneath. 28 pounds. The four men stood in silence, staring at what John held. This was not luck. This was not an accident. This was a vein of wealth running through land they had walked on their entire lives without seeing. The 28-pound nugget was worth over $6,000, more than $130,000 in today's currency. It was the largest gold discovery ever recorded in the United States at that time. But John Reed had learned his lesson. He did not ride into town shouting about gold. He did not tell his neighbors. He and his partners made a calculated decision that afternoon, standing in the creek with fortune in their hands. Keep it quiet. They knew what publicity would bring. Thieves, squatters, chaos. Their land would be overrun, their operation destroyed. So they worked in silence. They continued farming during the day, maintaining the appearance of ordinary life. At night and on weekends, they mined. They pulled gold from the creek, melted it down, and quietly transported it to the Philadelphia Mint, the only federal facility that could convert raw gold into legal currency. For 20 years, the secret held. Between 1804 and 1824, thousands of ounces of North Carolina gold flowed into Philadelphia's vaults, while John Reed's neighbors assumed he was just another tobacco farmer. He purchased new equipment. He expanded his property. He lived more comfortably. People noticed, but no one understood why, until 1824, when a local newspaper published the story. The article revealed everything: the nuggets, the partnership, the decades of secret mining, the shipments to Philadelphia. Within days, the story spread across North Carolina. Within weeks, it reached Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia. Within months, it was national news. The reaction was not gradual, it was explosive. On a Tuesday morning in April 1825, a farmer named William Harris read the newspaper article about Reed's gold at breakfast. By noon, he had abandoned his plow in the middle of a half-plowed field and was digging in the creek behind his property. By sunset, 3 of his neighbors had joined him. Within a week, 17 men were tearing apart every water source within 5 miles of the Reed farm, some working land they did not own, some fighting over access to the same streams. This pattern repeated across central North Carolina. Farmers walked away from crops. Shopkeepers closed their stores. Men who had never held a shovel for anything but planting were suddenly waist-deep in creeks, sifting through gravel with desperate focus. Land that had been worthless, too rocky for agriculture, too wet for building, became the most valuable real estate in the state. By 1828, more than 30 gold mines were operating in the region. Charlotte transformed from a modest county seat into the center of American gold production. New towns appeared almost overnight, rough settlements built around promising creek beds, filled with miners, merchants, gamblers, and opportunists. The infrastructure of the old agricultural economy buckled under the weight of sudden wealth and sudden greed. Property disputes clogged local courts. Partnerships formed over handshakes and collapsed over accusations of theft. Men who had been neighbors for decades stopped speaking. Some got rich, most did not. But everyone dug, because the possibility of finding what John Reed had found, a 28-pound fortune lying in a creek, was too powerful to resist. And John Reed, the man who had once been cheated out of $3,600, watched it all from his now heavily guarded property. He had become one of the wealthiest men in North Carolina, but the quiet life he had tried to protect was gone forever. The secret he had buried for 2 decades was now the most famous story in the state. The anger that had driven him back to the creek in 1802 had accomplished more than personal revenge. It had ignited America's first gold rush, transformed an entire regional economy, and proven that the nation's treasure was not just in distant mountains or foreign lands. It was buried in backyards, waiting for someone stubborn enough, or cheated badly enough, to keep digging. But the story was far from over. The chaos John had tried to avoid by staying silent was now fully unleashed, and it would spread far beyond North Carolina's creeks. The question was no longer whether there was gold in America. The question was how much, and who would control it. Chapter 3. The Mine That Outlived Its Founder. By the early 1830s, John Reed was a wealthy man, but his control over the world he had created was beginning to slip. The farm that had once been a quiet patch of North Carolina soil was now known across the state as the place where American gold had first been found. People who had never met him spoke his name in taverns and newspapers. Gold had lifted him out of obscurity, and now it was starting to pull everything around him out of his hands. The mine no longer resembled the simple operation he had started in the creek with wooden pans and a handful of partners. Over the years, shafts had been driven down into the earth, following veins of quartz shot through with gold. Tunnels branched out horizontally, supported by rough timber. Water had to be pumped out. Ore had to be hauled up, crushed, washed, and sorted. The work was dangerous, wet, and exhausting, but the returns were too large to ignore. With expansion came a new kind of problem. John could not watch everything anymore. He had once known every man who stepped into the water with a pan, could call them by name, knew their families and their situations. Now, there were more workers, some from neighboring counties, some from farther away, drawn by the reputation of the Reed mine. They came for wages, for the chance to be close to gold, or simply because there was work here when other fields failed. And wherever gold passed through many hands, temptation followed. It started with rumors: a small nugget gone missing from a wash trough, a sack of ore that seemed lighter than when it had been loaded, a worker seen slipping something into his pocket at the end of a shift. Nothing proven, nothing large enough to make an example of anyone, but enough to force John into a role he had never wanted, that of a man who had to assume that anyone, at any time, might be trying to take what was his. He responded the only way he knew how, with tighter control. He ordered closer counting of ore as it came up from the shafts. He had the most trusted men oversee the sorting and washing. He restricted who could approach the areas where the richest material was processed. The mine, once a place of shared excitement over each new find, began to feel watched. The men still worked, but they knew the eyes were on them as much as on the rock. Inside the partnership, the mood had changed as well. In the beginning, standing in the creek holding the first big nugget, John and his 3 partners had been equals in discovery. Years later, they were businessmen managing an operation that had to pay wages, buy timber and tools, repair equipment, and deal with a constant flow of people and problems. Decisions about reinvesting profits, opening new shafts, or scaling back for safety were no longer simple. Each choice meant someone earned less in the short term, or risked more in the long term. Arguments that would once have ended with a shrug now lingered. There were no fistfights, no public betrayals, but small disagreements accumulated like silt in the bottom of a stream. One man wanted to hire more workers to speed up production. Another argued they were already pushing the mine too hard. One wanted to invest in better machinery. Another wanted to take more profit out as coin and land. On paper, they were still partners. In practice, they were four men with different visions of how long the gold would last, and what to do before it ran out. While the Reed mine struggled with its own growing pains, the world outside it was shifting. More and more mines opened across North Carolina. What had once been Reed's miracle became a regional industry. Other landowners sank shafts into their own creeks and hillsides. Some found enough gold to build a small town around their workings. Others found only rock and debt. Local courts filled with disputes over claims, boundaries, and broken promises. Merchants built their fortunes supplying tools, food, and credit to mining camps. The Reed mine was no longer unique. It was the oldest, the most famous, but no longer the only game in town. For John Reed personally, the most significant shift came not from the ground, but from time itself. He was getting older. The work, the decisions, the constant vigilance wore on him. What had started as a bold act of defiance, going back to the creek after being cheated, had turned into a life's work that demanded more energy than any one man could give it forever. The question he had once asked in anger, "How much gold is there?" had been replaced by a different one. What happens to all of this when I'm gone? In 1845, before the Reed mine had exhausted its veins, John Reed died. He left behind land, a still-producing mine, and a story that had already become larger than his own life. The operation did not stop with his death. His descendants and associates continued to work the property, and for years it remained one of the region's notable sources of gold. But something fundamental had shifted. The man whose stubbornness and suspicion had shaped every decision was no longer there to enforce his way of doing things. Without him, the mine's fate slowly began to reflect the wider truth about gold in America. No discovery, no matter how important, stayed at the center of attention forever. By the late 1840s, another set of rumors had begun to drift eastward. Whispers of gold, not in creeks and small veins, but in massive deposits on the far side of the continent. Men in North Carolina taverns and general stores heard talk of a place called California, of nuggets pulled from riverbeds by the handful, of a rush that made even the richest Carolina claims sound modest. Some laughed it off. Others listened very carefully. The Reed mine had started the story of American gold. In the next chapter, that story was about to move thousands of miles west, and the quiet hills of North Carolina, once the focus of a region's obsession, would find themselves suddenly in the shadow of a new, roaring frontier. Chapter 4. Forgotten Firstborn. On January 24, 1848, a carpenter named James W. Marshall found gold in the tail race of a sawmill along the American River in California. The nugget he pulled from the water was not especially large. The sight was not particularly dramatic. But the timing, the scale, and the sheer chaos that followed would rewrite the map of American ambition and consign North Carolina's gold fields to the edges of historical memory. Within months, news of California's gold spread like fire through dry grass. Newspapers across the country published breathless accounts of riches waiting to be claimed. Men abandoned farms, shops, families, and debts to go west. Ships crowded harbors. Wagon trains stretched across plains. The rush was not just a migration, it was a fever. By 1849, over 90,000 people had arrived in California, more than had moved into the entire North Carolina gold belt over 2 decades. The scale was incomprehensible to anyone who had worked the Carolina creeks. This was not careful extraction by a handful of farmers. This was a stampede. Back in North Carolina, miners who had spent years developing skills in hard rock tunneling and creek panning read the reports with a mixture of disbelief and envy. California's gold, they were told, could be picked up off the ground. Rivers glittered with it. Men with no experience were filling their pockets in days. The painstaking, dangerous work of driving shafts into Carolina quartz suddenly seemed outdated. Some left. They sold their claims, packed what they could carry, and joined the westward tide. Others stayed, insisting the Carolina fields still had value, that California was exaggerated, that steady work closer to home was smarter than chasing rumors across a continent. But even those who stayed felt the shift. Investment dried up. Equipment suppliers focused on outfitting those heading west. The energy, the attention, the national conversation, it all turned toward California. The Reed mine, which had once been the most famous gold operation in the United States, was now just a regional footnote. What made California's dominance so complete was not just the quantity of gold, though estimates suggest California produced more in its first 5 years than North Carolina had in 30, but the mythology that came with it. California gold was tied to ideas of frontier freedom, individual fortune, and the possibility that any ordinary person could strike it rich overnight. The American dream, which had always been abstract, suddenly had a location and a verb: go west and dig. North Carolina's gold, by contrast, had no myth. It had been found quietly, worked carefully, and kept largely secret for years. It belonged to farmers and partnerships, not to adventurers and gamblers. It was respectable, profitable, and utterly forgettable in the face of California's wild, uncontrolled explosion of wealth. John Reed had been dead for 3 years when California became the center of the gold universe. He never saw how quickly the discovery he had built his life around could be overshadowed. His mine continued to operate, his descendants still pulled ore from the ground, but the attention was gone. Newspapers that once would have noted a good find from the Reed property now barely mentioned Carolina gold at all. By the 1850s, even the language had changed. When people spoke of the gold rush, they meant California. When they spoke of the first gold discovery, most assumed it had happened at Sutter's Mill in 1848. The fact that a 12-year-old boy had pulled a 17-pound nugget from a Carolina creek 50 years earlier became a piece of regional trivia, something mentioned in local histories, but absent from the national story. History, it turned out, did not care who was first. It cared who was loudest. Yet the legacy of John Reed and the North Carolina Gold Belt was not as invisible as it seemed. The techniques developed in Carolina mines, shaft digging, hydraulic washing, organized labor, became standard practice in California and later in other mining regions. Men who had learned their trade in North Carolina creeks brought that knowledge west and applied it on a larger scale. The infrastructure of American mining, from equipment suppliers to assay offices, had been tested first in the hills around Charlotte before it exploded across the Sierra Nevada. Even the financial systems that handled gold had been shaped by Carolina's early discoveries. The decision to establish a U.S. mint branch in Charlotte in 1837, more than a decade before California, was a direct result of Reed's mine and the other operations that followed it. That mint processed millions of dollars worth of gold and established protocols that would later be used in San Francisco. The boring, administrative work of turning raw metal into legal currency had been worked out first in the place no one remembered. John Reed's greatest contribution, though, was not technical or financial. It was psychological. He had proven that gold existed in the United States, not as a rumor or an import, but as something that could be pulled from American soil by American hands. Before Reed, gold was something that came from elsewhere, from Spanish colonies, from European reserves, from distant mountains. After Reed, it was something that might be anywhere, waiting under the feet of ordinary people. That shift in thinking, the idea that fortune could be found, not inherited or earned through traditional means, but simply discovered, was the seed that grew into California's frenzy. Reed planted it in 1799 with a rock he did not recognize. California harvested it 50 years later with a continent's worth of believers. The Reed gold mine operated, on and off, well into the 20th century. long after John Reed's death, long after California's initial rush had faded into industrial operations, long after gold itself had lost its romantic allure, people still dug into the Carolina earth, looking for what remained. The site eventually became a state historic site, preserved not for its wealth, most of the easy gold was long gone, but for its place in a story that few people outside North Carolina even knew. In the end, John Reed's story is not about who found the most gold or who became the most famous. It is about what happens when the world suddenly realizes that what you are standing on is worth more than anyone imagined, and how quickly that realization can turn a quiet life into something unrecognizable. California got the glory. Reed got there first. And in the long, tangled history of American obsession with wealth, luck, and the possibility that the ground beneath your feet might change everything, being first turned out to matter less than most people thought it would. But it mattered enough. Enough that the story survived, even when the nation forgot it. Enough that a 12-year-old boy pulling a rock from a creek became the invisible beginning of one of the largest migrations in American history. 50 years is a long time to be forgotten, but some stories, buried under louder ones, eventually find their way back to the surface, just like the gold that started it all.